Dr. Ruiz again, and today we are moving on to Unit 5, Lecture 5 in this series. Almost getting close to the end of the semester. I can't believe how fast it's going. But alas, we are now transitioning from Unit 4, which discussed existentialism in terms of the question of meaning and personal identity. Namely, how is it that we invest our lives with meaning by virtue of the kind of meaning that we can create through our choices and our actions. So we're going to transition from some of the themes in personal identity and the question of meaning and existentialism to another subfield in philosophy that is known as feminist philosophy. Now, the goal of this sort of unit is to try to show you what it is about feminist philosophy that might be different from, let's say, just feminism in general, or feminist sociology, or theories of feminism, through the film Boys Don't Cry. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to slowly kind of walk through the branch of philosophy known as value theory. Now, feminist philosophy is going to be one of the many sort of subfields within value theory. So value theory is the overall category. That's one of the main branches of philosophy. Now that branch will then go and split off into many different branches, one of them being feminist philosophy. So what I want to do is I want you to get an appreciation or a sense of what value theory is by exploring feminist philosophy. We could have just as easily done aesthetic philosophy, moral reasoning, moral philosophy, philosophy of law, but alas, this one pairs very, very well with the movie Boys Don't Cry. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started and try to understand what one of these subfields in philosophy is. All right, so now philosophy, as we've come to define it throughout this course, is traditionally seen as always being concerned with knowledge as justified true belief. Right? That's the definition we've been working with. What is knowledge? It's not your personal opinion. It's not your sort of general intuition or mystical revelation. It is an argumentative-based, logically-based, justified, true belief, where beliefs are justified, right? Where our justifications have to draw on rational structures of logical reasoning that are somehow seen as independent of human interests, right? To understand value theory, we have to kind of start there. On the usual view, on the traditional view, we see philosophy as concerned with knowledge as justified true belief, where that or those chains of justification and logical reasoning are seen as coming from an outside or independent source of human interest. Now, we're getting to the point of the course where we see that while that may be fine and good for reasoning about science and mathematics and even some aspects of metaphysics, in other words, this view of knowledge as justified true belief that's based on logical reasoning works really, really well for answering questions about, say, the nature of the world or our knowledge of it, right? We can ask questions like, how can I know for certain that that particular tree outside exists, or even I exist? But it gets a lot trickier when we start to ask questions about human practices, such as politics, or law, or ethics, or even art, right? So if we ask a question about what is the nature of that tree, then the view of knowledge as justified true belief is really, really great for answering. Well, what is it? It's made up of this. How do we know? Well, we can find out, logically defend it. We can poke it, we can prod it, we can make claims, we can reason it out. But it's a lot easier when we're talking about general fields like politics or ethics or art. So just like these fields are kind of seem to be a little bit more broad or ambiguous, what starts to appear is the idea that things like moral reasoning, right, forming valid social judgments. Whenever we talk about moral reasoning, we talk about how it is that we form valid social judgments, like what is good, what is deemed acceptable, the thou shalt or thou shalt nots, that we sort of accept and codify in society, right? Why should we be good? What does a good person look like? So moral reasoning in all of these fields, like politics, law, ethics, or art, is really a lot harder because kind of by their very definition, these fields are going to involve values that are already laden with human attitudes and beliefs. So what does that mean? What does it mean to say that fields like politics, law, ethics, and art are already laden with human attitudes and beliefs? Well, what that means is that, first and foremost, they're not objective the way that we would think of mathematical reasoning. For instance, if we ask, is this action just? Or how is this artwork beautiful? We're sort of already assuming a notion of justice, right? Or in the latter case, a notion of beauty. That's actually, in fact, the product of our social and historical situations. Think of it this way. Certain cultures will look at something and think it beautiful, and vice versa. In Western culture, we may not see it beautifully or even hear atonal music and say, oh, that sounds harmonious or beautiful. It will actually sound dissonant and not melodious and not beautiful to our ears. But again, those are social and historical constructions. So this kind of brings up a problem in philosophy. Philosophy is concerned with kind of logically, rationally defending one's claims. How do you then go about doing that with fields that are already value-laden, with all that already seem to presuppose a certain value for those fields to exist in the first place, like art, right? Art has a notion of beauty or morality. Anything in morality already has, just to ask the question, is that moral, already involves a prior conception of justice that we've already bought into or kind of socially agreed that justice is something in society, right? And we can contest its fine subtleties through law and case laws, and we can sort of negotiate changes to the law. But at the end of the day, we say things like, thou shalt not kill, or and codify them into law. So in order to deal with this particular quandary in philosophy, philosophy developed a branch of study or subfield that we call value theory that incorporates these, for lack of a better term right now, sort of subjective or non-objective social attitudes into a systematic way of making sense of human practices through, for example, careful, logical reflection about our attitudes and beliefs in these fields. So it incorporates a very systematic way of making sense of human practices through careful, logical reflection about our attitudes and beliefs in this field. So on this account, value theory is the subfield of philosophy that deals with branches of knowledge that involve any kind of subjective or evaluative, because you're making an evaluation, right? A subjective evaluation aspects, such as moral philosophy, social political philosophy, feminist philosophy, aesthetics, right? Anything that involves some prior judgment that's not truly completely objective is going to fall under value theory. Now, what you have to remember about value theory is that you can still pursue questions of knowledge that are already sort of vested or loaded with a certain value, right? The cards are already stacked, or the deck is stacked, or something of that sort, with a particular value of justice or beauty. But you can still pursue it in a systematic, comprehensive, sort of logical way where you can defend your claims, albeit knowing that those claims are very much invested and already shaped or already latent with a particular looking glass or looking lens through which you view certain attitudes and beliefs. So once again, value theory is going to incorporate these subjective social attitudes into a systematic way, it's like a system of making sense of human practices through careful, logical reflection about our attitudes and beliefs in fields like political philosophy or moral philosophy or art. Now, to take just one example, one particular subfield within this branch or subfield of philosophy is feminist philosophy. Now, this is not too hard to see because feminist philosophy already includes a value judgment of pursuing feminist concerns, right? Feminist philosophy is going to look at philosophy or questions, philosophical questions from a feminist perspective. It's already loaded in a certain way. Now, how it pursues feminist concerns? How it pursues feminist concerns? In other words, by making careful and clear distinctions, using logical reasoning and critical analysis, it's what makes it feminist philosophy, okay? How it goes about pursuing feminist concerns, by making careful, clear distinctions or using logical reasoning or critical analysis, that's what makes it feminist philosophy, as opposed to feminist theories of sociology or just feminist proclivities in general, or a feminist artistic perspective, or a feminist sensibility, or a feminist worldview. That's what makes it feminist philosophy. How you go about pursuing feminist concerns, by making careful, clear distinctions, using logical reasoning and critical analysis. So by the time we get to Rebecca Harderhand's article, where she breaks down sort of three main ways of looking at gender, that's a prime example of breaking things down into clear distinctions using logical reasoning in order to make some very clear evaluative claims based on sort of sound principles. Okay, so let's go on to the next thing. Now, feminist philosophy, of course, is a very incredibly broad field with a complex, long history, Western and non-Western. And so for the sake of brevity and the kind of level that an introductory course allows for, we're going to examine feminist philosophy within the kind of scope of the question of personal identity. We've kind of already been sticking to this theme throughout the course, so we're going to continue with this theme of the question of personal identity. It's always a constant concern, a key philosophical dilemma in philosophy. So we're going to see how this plays out, how feminist philosophy actually works through personal identity. So let me explain it this way, because this is going to kind of introduce us to Harderhand's article that you had to read for this week. So as we said for the last sort of 2 weeks, the existential tradition in philosophy raised the question of what makes life meaningful in the broader sense of the term, right? What is it that is really meaningful in terms of living one's life in the broad sense, not just how do I know I exist, how do I know that I'm actually a thing, a substance extended in space, but how can that make my life meaningful in the robust sense? Now, it was a really important corrective to the sort of seemingly reductive, very rationalist view of what makes us selves for Descartes, right? Or Cartesian philosophy, because on his view, it's just our mental and rational abilities that make us who we are, and that's what gives meaning to our identities. And so existentialism was really important in correcting that really reductive, rationalist view of human existence. Now, in a very similar manner, feminist philosophy is going to come in and do to existentialism what existentialism did to rationalism by sort of correcting it a little bit. In other words, in a very like manner, feminist philosophers in the 20th century actually started to begin to raise certain criticisms of this broad existentialist view of personal identity, the whole, life as art, life as meaning view of personal identity. So on the one hand, feminist philosophers said, okay, all right, yes, I grant you that it's true that that this view considers the broader aspects of human existence or the human condition when asking about meaning in general than the rationalist tradition did, right? So feminist philosophers are going to say, okay, we like that existentialism comes in and looks a little bit deeper or actually steps back a little, right? Instead of seeing the tree, it looks at the forest and says, all right, so now we know what a tree is made of, but how does that help us get clear about the fact that there is a forest and that we have an experience of the forest, our ability to live in a forest, right? It's able to take a step back, like existentialism, and ask about the human condition and about meaning in general. But, feminist philosophers began to say, just asking the question of what makes life worth living, again in the richer, more robust existential sense, actually, on the feminist view, feminist philosophy view, overlooks the role of society in determining the answer to that question. Let me go ahead and repeat that, make sure we understand that. So, number one, on the one hand, feminist philosophers liked something about existentialism. What did they like? That they corrected something, a defect that they believed existed in rationalist philosophy or Cartesianism, right? That very reductive view of the self as a brute substance. We are our minds. Because that just doesn't get us any closer to the question, who are we? A mind? Well, okay, that's okay to write down on an exam if you're taking maybe a physics exam or a metaphysics exam, but that doesn't really answer the question as humans, right? So they like that existentialism corrected that really reductive rationalist view. But just asking about meaning in general, feminist philosophers said, asking the question of what makes life worth living in this richer, more robust existential sense, still, so number two here, this is critical, still on the feminist philosophy view, overlooks the role of society in determining the answer to that question. What does that mean? Okay? Well, it means that the going belief here, or the underlying assumption here on the feminist philosophical view, is that the extent to which our lives are indeed our own, right? If you're an existentialist, you're like, my life is my own, I will make it my own. The idea that the extent to which our lives are really our own has to be reconsidered if the possible answers to the question of personal identity are always going to be guided in advance by forces outside the individual. Okay? Let me repeat that. So the existentialist is going to say, I have to figure out who I am. I am a self-fashioning, self-creating being. I impart and give meaning and significance to my life. That is the task of life, through our choices, right, as Sartre would say, to take a stand on our choices and thereby imbue or impart meaning on our lives. And so thereby develop a sense of self or personal identity. The feminist philosopher is going to come in and say, yeah, that's all fine and good, but this still overlooks the extent to which the answers to that question about who we are, making our lives our own, are always guided in advance by forces outside the individual. So they're saying, you're forgetting, what existentialists, or particularly what Sartre rejected as factors of determinism, right? And Sartre is going to reject any factor of determinism. Feminist philosophers are going to come in and say, not so fast, not so easy. You can't just say, oh, forget, social construction, or forget about factors outside the individual that determine our lives in advance, kind of like essences. Remember, for existentialism, existence comes before or precedes essence. Feminist philosophers are saying, yeah, we agree, but not so fast. Because there's some essences you can't just say, yeah, I'm not going to pay attention to that. Because they shape and guide our meaning in advance of our possible interpretation of that meaning. They make our identities possible in the first place. Feminist philosophers will argue when talking about the question of personal identity. Okay, so if you're getting lost here, let's give you some examples, right? So, for instance, let's say if I'm an existentialist and I want to give meaning to my life in a way that society does not acknowledge as a possibility, right? Not only will I lack the language on the feminist view to describe what I may be feeling, but I will likely feel really isolated and confused about my identity, right? In such a way that I actually do not feel my life to be truly meaningful. I'm just sort of being tossed about at sea by the forces around me. Feminist philosophy is thereby going to take up questions of personal identity as one of its core concerns. So that on this view, while we have the sort of in existentialism, this generalized individual, right? In scare quotes, the general individual, right? That was at the forefront of sort of existential philosophy. Philosophy just talks about the individual in general, this abstract, sort of raw, brute individual. And it doesn't go any further about describing or characterizing or qualifying that individual. It's just the individual, and the task of that individual is to become who one is, to become oneself. So feminist philosophy is going to take up this concern of the generalized individual in the existential tradition and reject it. It's going to reject this generalized individual. Why? Because feminist philosophers argued that this general sort of idealized individual doesn't exist. It's just a theoretical construct. In other words, there's no actual idealized individual that doesn't operate in culture. In fact, it's actually just the opposite. There's no such thing as a generalized individual. Nobody goes around and saying, look at that individual, look at that generalized identity. What actually tends to happen in concrete existence is not a general identity, but rather a specific identity. It is a specific individual, a specific identity that is the one that has to actually move through the various sort of legal, social, juridical, political, educational, medical institutions of our lives. So, for example, you don't see just this generalized, existential, nebulous sort of soul walking around, this sort of generalized man of existentialism trying to become a self. It's not an abstract individual that walks about the world and has to bear the forces of culture in the individual versus the culture equation, right? It's not an abstract individual, but rather, for example, coming up with examples here, it's a sort of middle-aged Anglo-Saxon woman, or an immigrant teenager, or a Latino businessman that actually has to move through society and make sense of the world through those identities. You don't move about the world and make sense of your identity, either accept it or reject it, whatever you want to do with it, even on the existentialist tradition. You don't move about just as a general little I, and then you say, who am I? You actually move about the world as a philosophy professor of a certain age, as a engineering major with a particular history and home life, as a black man or woman with a particular social and historical tradition or commitment to certain social values, somebody that identifies as part of LGBTQ community or a sexual minority. You move about the world and institutions, even on the existentialist view, feminists argue, not as an idealized individual, but as an actual concrete individual that is shaped by specific identities. Therefore, the feminist philosophers argue with regards to the question of personal identity, if we want to know about the role of personal identity in the construction of meaning of our lives, then we're going to have to include categories of analysis like race, sex, gender, and age, disability, just to name a few, of course, in our philosophies. Now, traditionally, the existentialists like Sartre are going to reject this, right? Because Sartre is going to say you're a self-fashioning being and you can sort of reject any identity. But that's under the assumption, feminist philosophers will argue, that you move about the world as a generalized, individualized, abstract little I, right? Not an I in terms of a visual I, but in terms of a consciousness, the first person speaker. So the first person speaker, I, you don't just go around saying I as a general, you say I from the point of view or perspective of a 21st century young American, perhaps a Republican, perhaps libertarian, perhaps a Democrat, perhaps an anarchist, perhaps whatever kind of political identification, just to name one among many. And so you body forth in the world on the basis of personal identities that are very much shaped by forces outside the individual. Race, sex, gender, ethnicity, orientation, politics, perspectives, religion. All of those are sort of incarnated and fleshened in your body, so that when you go to open your mouth, you're speaking from a particular perspective. And this is what feminist philosophers believe that the general existentialist tradition has overlooked. So one famous example is going to be Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre's famous philosopher wife, who wrote one of the greatest treatises in the 20th century in feminist philosophy, known as The Second Sex, a very important book in the 20th century for feminism in general. And her argument goes something like this, right? Sartre neglects the extent to which our choices are limited in advance by forces outside the individual. So that if you're a woman in sort of, growing up in 16th century England, your choices to make of your identity what you will it to be are going to be limited in advance of their interpretation by virtue of very, very real social and historical factors. The same way that you just can't get up and be whatever you want to be if you're growing up with a racial signifier of black in the antebellum South. The forces outside the individual are going to deeply, deeply impact the kind of choices you can take up in the first place in order to make meaning in your life or to make your choices meaningful. So we've got to look at categories of analysis like race, sex, gender, and age in determining the meaning of life within the sort of concrete social forces that affect us. And this is what Rebecca Hanrahan is actually arguing, beginning on page 78 of her article. So the first thing she says is, she opens up some of you may probably be too young to remember this constant character from Saturday Night Live, but she says, look, in the 90s there was this recurrent character in Saturday Night Live, and that was this sort of a gender ambiguous character named Pat. Nobody could figure out if it were a man or a woman, and Pat was always in this sort of general situations where not only did people not know how to engage with Pat on the basis of gendered or social constructions, but Pat, him or herself, did not know how to go about the world, what bathroom to use. So it was always a sort of calling attention to these gendered assumptions of moving about the world on the basis of taking our gender, just taking it for granted. So she says on page 78, she says, thus, the meaningfulness of life, right? Because that's what the existentialists were up to. They're like, look, we can give you meaning in life if you just choose things. And feminist philosophers are saying, yeah, no, not quite. We can't totally choose things. She says, thus the meaningfulness of life depends on our living in accord with a sense of self that we can affirm as our own. In this way, the meaningfulness of life depends on our personal identity. Moreover, as we just learned from the example of Pat, our personal identity depends on our gender identity. In other words, we live in a world in which to take up no gender identity whatsoever would be very difficult, because you have to navigate concrete social institutions, right? When you go to school, you have to take breaks, and you have to take bathroom breaks, even as a little kid, and you have a choice to make, right? There's the bathroom with the symbol of a skirt, and then there's a bathroom with the symbol of the non-skirt or the pants, right? You move about concrete situations. So she says, what each of us do believe and feel is a function of our gender. Okay, so what would the existentialists say about that? The existentialists would reject that statement. Why? Because on this view, gender comes before the feeling, right? We feel something because our gender makes us say, oh, cool, or ew, or have a certain feeling towards it. Oh, that's great, that outfit's really pretty. We're already socialized a certain way. And the existentialist, it says, no, you're a self-fashioning being. You can feel whatever you want. If you're a guy, you can look at a dress and say, oh, that's cool, I want to wear that. Or girl, and have the same attitudes towards sort of non-feminine vestments and ways of dressing. She continues, thus, having a gender identity is seemingly necessary for our lives to be meaningful. Aha. That's a rejection of the kind of Sartrean existentialism, right? Because the Sartrean existentialist is going to say, you don't need any essences that come before your concrete existence to give meaning to your life. You make your own meaning. You impart your own meaning. You don't need a social category, be it gender or race or ethnicity or levels of wealth or profession, whatever you want, to impart meaning. And the feminist view says, yeah, you do, because we body forth in a world not as individuals without an identity. We body forth as women or as men or as with a queer identity. We body forth in particular ways. So gender identity, if we want to ask the deep existential question of what makes meaning in our lives, what imparts meaning, then on the feminist philosophy view, we're going to have to seriously consider and analyze, critically analyze, categories of race, sex, gender, age, and so forth. Okay? Hope that makes sense here. Let's move on. So, this is a little famous gingerbread, right? It's oversimplification, very reductive, but it at least outlines for you some very basic. There's always a risk with all these. We always worry as philosophy professors every time we put something on the board that we are immediately sort of reducing it to something that doesn't do justice to the complexity of an argument or the perspective. But alas, it's a 2000 level class, so I am going to restrain myself and give you the gingerbread version, the gingerbread man version of the three theories of gender. Yes, this is what it's come to. We haven't quite gotten to another kitty meme, but we might have to come to that. Nonetheless, so throughout her article, Harnahan is giving us three main theories of gender identity in feminist philosophy. So the first thing to say about that is look what she's doing. How is she pursuing feminist philosophy? Because it's not just that she's pursuing feminist concerns. She's pursuing them in how is she pursuing them? She's pursuing them in a way that uses clarifications, makes careful, clear distinctions, using logical reasoning and critical analysis. This is what makes this article feminist philosophy, not just a feminist perspective. How she goes about doing this is what makes it feminist philosophy. So, and for the purposes of the exam, you're really going to have to get really good at knowing these three. You're going to have to be able to differentiate in all sorts of ways and give me different examples, these three different theories. The realist theory of gender, the social constructivist theory, and the subjectivist theory. Okay. In the broadest possible way, the realist theory is going to correspond to biological sex. Again, once again, some of these are oversimplifications, but for the purposes of this. The social constructivist, or sometimes we say constructionist, like construction paper, because you're constructing something, or a constructive account. Either one is actually works in some ways. The social constructivist theory of identity, which in the broadest sense is how we interpret our biological sex. Gender would be an example. We interpret our biological sex. So the fact that we're born with either female or male genitalia might, on this view, make us feel like we are more or less feminine, to use one example. And And then there's the subjectivist theory. Here it's equated with orientation. That just is equated with feeling, your subjectivist feeling. The subject's feeling or basic sort of phenomenological orientation about how that gender makes you feel, or how you feel the weight of those social categories in terms of your actual existence. So now let's go through and break those distinctions down one by one and make sure we get really good at understanding them, okay? All right, here we go. The realist theory. Okay, the realist theory of gender identity at the end of the day is going to hold that your gender identity is determined by your sex, okay? So write down realist theory equals sex as biology. In other words, it rests on the sort of sex-gender distinction, but where sex is seen as biologically determined. Underline, highlight, smiley face, circle the word biological, biologically determined. The realist account is a biologically reductive view of gender identity. In other words, what it is that makes us male or female, if you're a realist, is going to be based on purely biological determinations. And whenever you catch yourself, let's say somebody says, hey, are you a man or a woman? If you catch yourself saying, oh, I'm a woman because I was born with, clearly we can take a test, or sometimes a genetic. You can say, well, we can look at chromosomes and say genetically, biologically speaking, I either have an XX chromosome or an XY chromosome, and therefore that makes me either this or that. That's going to be a realist view of gender. It's important right before anything to say that this is not true in itself, but rather is one particular theory, one way of looking, just like the other theories are not true in themselves, but are actually perspectives. So on page 79, Dr. Hanrahan explains. She says, to be a realist about something is to take the position that facts about a thing hold, and circle the word here, independently of human beliefs. Above the word independently, you can write objectivity, right, or objectively. That the facts about a thing hold independently of human beliefs, attitudes, and opinions. So instead, these facts are determined usually by some physical, biological, or chemical state of the world, right? There's that sort of actual world out there, on that real world on this view, and it actually exists out there. It's made up of biological factors, chemical compositions. So she says, you can be a realist about all sorts of things. So, for example, to be a realist about electrons is to believe that whether or not electrons exist does not depend on your believing in their existence. Rather, their existence depends only on whether or not there are actually elemental particles in the world that are negatively charged. And if you say yes, that's a realist view. Remember, realist view doesn't mean that it actually true for real exists, etc. It just means that you believe that facts about a thing hold independently of our human beliefs. X is true independent of my human belief about it, right? Still can't prove it because there's the problem of knowledge always being interpreted through our minds. There's no way to actually prove it. But you still have to believe and hold that facts about a thing hold independently of human beliefs. Okay, so how does this apply to gender? Well, similarly, to be a realist about gender is to believe that a person's gender isn't determined by what she or he or others believe his or her gender to be. Instead, a person's gender is determined by certain physical, biological, chemical facts about the body, right? It's that simple. Does the person in question have a penis and XX chromosomes? Well, then he's a man. Or does the person instead have a vagina and XY chromosome? She's a woman then, right? And so as far as the realist is concerned, the body can answer all the questions we can ever ask about a person's gender, right? And so it's just gender on the realist view is determined by sex. What does that mean? You have to carry it a little bit further. That means it's a biologically reductive account. This is biological reductivism. It is reduced to biology. Gender on the realist account is determined by sex. What does that mean? That it is reduced to biology. Okay, gender on the realist account is determined by sex. What does that mean? That it is reduced to your biology. Where biology here is a brute, right? A brute fact that is believed to hold independent of human beliefs, attitudes, interpretations about something. So on this view, there's lots of different examples about this. The most prevalent, there's two places where the realist theory really pervades, and that is in medicine and law. In medicine and law, the realist theory tends to absolutely pervade. So you have a lot of different social institutions that make like legal distinctions and use gender, right? Can you compete if you want to compete in the Olympics, for example, and I may be wrong, somebody can correct me on this, put something on the blog or excuse me, on Canvas if I'm incorrect, but if you want to participate in an Olympic sport on either a women's team or a men's team, if there's any contestation about whether you're a man or a woman, it's always going to be the realist theory that prevails, right? In other words, they can do a genetic test. There was not too long ago, I believe, and someone correct me too, if I'm wrong about this, but there was a runner, I think it was maybe a world competition, running championship, and there was a question about her abilities because she had there's such an athletic physiology and toned physique and she was breaking all sorts of records, and so therefore, her gender was held in question, and she was forced to submit to genetic testing about whether, she had XX chromosomes in order to determine whether she was a man or a woman, even though since birth or by all and every single possible account that one could give of a person's life, this person's consistently was determined to be, by every account, other than the realist theory, a woman, and even under the realist theory. So that's an example of how it shows up. The military will use a realist theory as well. And definitely in medicine, up until very, very recent medical history, very, very recently. So many times, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, with cases of where the biological sex was ambiguous, in cases of hermaphroditism, or being born with both male and female genitalia, or there's also fascinating accounts of individuals that are born, they're known as chimeras, from the Greek, changeable properties. They're at the genetic level, the DNA level, share different sets of DNA, or have a sort of a type of mutational characteristic that you are not the same person in terms of your DNA. Absolutely fascinating, but I digress here. The point here is that an example of this realist position is in medicine. In the 1940s and 50s, if medical professionals thought that your gender was ambiguous, many times in the 20th century, doctors would make really ethically suspect decisions in cases of gender ambiguity with intersex individuals or hermaphrodite births. And just sort of choose one for the sake of having a clear, distinctive definition of growing into culture, rather than having the child grow into their own sexual identity and acculturation, making certain choices. So that's an example. I think there's certainly many more cases. You can chime in on the discussions as well, but those are the clear distinctions. Okay, let's go on to the next one. An example of, but before going on to the next one, this is a very, very good example of the realist construction of identity. So not too long ago, there was this, back when Oprah still had her show, there was this famous case of gender ambiguity with Thomas Beatty, right? And Thomas Beatty was, it was the first time that you had all these headlines about a man giving birth, and it was the world's sort of quote-unquote first pregnant man. I put the article to a link there, the link to an article there. And so people were absolutely fascinated by this because They were saying, how can this be? Look, he looks like a man, he thinks he's a man, he acts like a man, he performs maleness, right? He performs all of the activities, married to a woman, has facial hair, is a very athletic, all the social signifiers. And the debate really surrounded a realist definition of identity. So people said, yeah, it's not really the world's first pregnant man, because by definition, Thomas Beatty cannot be a man because he has female chromosomes, and therefore he has the reproductive capacity and the sexual anatomy of a woman, a childbearing woman. And so therefore, on the realist perspective, there is absolutely no confusion, right? Beatty's reproductive capacity clearly identifies him as a woman. He just happens to, I keep saying he because that seems like the right descriptor here. But he certainly would be considered a woman under the realist construction of identity. Okay, so I think that one is pretty clear. The second dominant theory of gender is the social constructivist theory. Now, the social constructivist theory of gender holds that your gender is not determined by anatomy. Okay, so it goes against the realist perspective. The social constructivist theory holds that your gender is not determined by anatomy. Okay, but it will say that it can play a part. That doesn't mean that you don't have a biological sex. That doesn't mean you don't have male or female or intersex genitalia. That doesn't mean that. You may still have it, right? But the sexuality and gender is actually not wholly based on that. It's actually based on not on the physical attributes you have, but it's based on how well a person is able to successfully perform or fulfill the kind of criteria set forth by society of what constitutes a gendered identity. In other words, what characteristics are socially associated with being a man or a particular woman. So no matter, it can play a part, but how you perform that sexuality is the result of social constructivism. So here Hanrahan writes on page 80, unlike realists, constructivists draw a distinction between sex and gender. Your sex is still determined by your anatomy, but your gender is determined by your ability to meet those criteria society associates with one gender as opposed to the other. But even though constructivists distinguish between sex and gender, they also acknowledge that a person's sex will often play some role in determining his or her gender, or their gender. So most societies see having a penis as a characteristic associated with being a man, but more importantly, this characteristic is merely associated with this gender. It is not a characteristic that you must have in order to be a man. Thus, for constructivists, you can be a man and lack a penis, or you can be a woman and lack a vagina. In fact, what we're going to see here is that for the social constructivist, there is no one essential characteristic that determines your gender. So, at the end of the day, the very first thing you have to remember about social constructivism is that it draws a very important distinction between sex and gender. The realist position just goes with sex. Sure, it talks about gender as derivative of what your sex tells you are. You have penis or your vagina, that's going to inform your gender. But more importantly, all that matters is gender doesn't matter as much as just the fact that you're either a man or you're a woman. And that just has to do with the sex you're born with. So another way of saying that is that for a realist, your sex is your gender, right? For a realist, your sex is your gender. That's simple. And the social constructivist account separates it. Once again, for the realist, your sex is your gender. For the realist, your sex is your gender. But for the social constructivist, you make a distinction, a very important distinction between sex as one thing and gender another. Now, don't forget, they're interrelated. Sure, they're not mutually exclusive. They can inform each other. But nonetheless, they are not the same thing. So while the social constructivists believe that sex is still determined by the anatomy you may be born with, Your gender is a completely different matter associated with the actions and roles you're able to perform in society. So your sex can be a man, but you can still perform being a woman, and therefore your gender is a woman. You are a woman. If you can act like a man successfully and consistently, then that becomes your gender identity, right? So we have many, many different examples when you have gender reassignment surgery, right? It's an attempt to change the realist perspective in order to have it, actually we're going to hold off with that example because it goes really, really well with the very last distinction. So now there's still a particular problem with this, right, for feminist philosophers. Now the feminist philosophers are going to have a worry about social constructivism, right? Because if social constructivism is just about performing roles, right, based on a social understanding or a stereotype in culture, a character, then this theory does not sufficiently acknowledge how certain societies can hold potentially harmful views of what it means to be a man or a woman. If to be a man means to be a very hyper-masculine, aggressive, machistic, a kind of, chest-puffing, Jersey Shore, I mean, just any type of stereotype of hypermasculinity, so long as you perform it consistently, then you're a man. It doesn't challenge any of those accounts. And so society can hold potentially harmful views of what it means to be a man or a woman without it being constructed as such. Okay, so let's take a look at examples. So this is a famous picture of, in the background is a famous gender theorist and philosopher, Judith Butler, whose famous theory is of gender performativity, that we perform gender. The gender is a verb that we do, we act, we enact it. It's not just reduced to biological sex. A good example of this is Lady Gaga's performance when the character of Jo, right? She came and wore a prosthetic and did all sorts of things in order to perform gender. So just like in Boys Don't Cry, one question would be, okay, so was Lady Gaga a man for the time in which she was performing, right, the alter ego Jo? And it's a good question. Was she a man? Because by all accounts, if you read the link to the article, she's stating character to such an extent that it was sort of uncanny. Now, it's very easy to get out of it by saying, yeah, she was performing it, but she was performing it as a performance, right? She's a performer. So she's not performing it the way that somebody that self-identifies as a man but was born biologically a woman performs the act of putting on, sneakers, putting on a tie, doing all of the folds, shaving, performs picking up the briefcase and opening and slamming doors, or whatever gender view of how you body forth as a man or you carry your weight around. That type of performance seems to be qualitatively different than the performance of a performer that stays at a different type of level. But then it raises a question, well, if on the social constructivist view, if you're actually doing it and doing it successfully, and that's what makes, that's what performs masculinity, if that's what defines one's gender for the moment that one is performing it, well then by that account, yes, Lady Gaga was her alter ego of Jo, the man for the time in which she was fully performing that. So that's a good kind of test question to think through. Now, the thing about the social construction of identity is that it's just that. It's a social construction. How many societies do we have? Exactly. There's not just one. So in the West, because we have a history of biological reductivism that comes to us from the ancient Greek metaphysical tradition that has certain kind of conceptual prejudices, what we have in the West is the notion that sex is either or. You're either a man or a woman. You can either perform being a man or a woman. You can choose to be either a man or a woman. And if you're confused about which, then we're going to medicalize it into an illness or a disorder. And we're going to call it gender identity disorder. We're going to vest it with the medicalized gaze of knowledge and authority and call it a disorder. Because in the West, we have WebMD and we legitimate things this way. So on this account, gender is a dichotomy, either male or female. And here, by looking at the definition on this hilarious aspect of WebMD, it says it's a basic element, right? A basic element that helps make up an individual's personal and identity and sense of self. Notice it being male or female, where gender ambiguity is seen as the catalyst for confusion, disorder, a clear going astray of a sense of self. Now, if we look at Native Amerindian cultures, here we have the Zuni tribe. We have what is known as the Berdache, and if you look at studies that some feminist anthropologists have done, like Polygon Allen, about Native Amerindian culture, is that because it did not inherit these Western cultural assumptions based on dualisms, either or, that it could accommodate what we would call in the West gender ambiguity in a way that was not seen as gender ambiguity. In a famous passage on the famous feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa gives a really moving account of how she grew up. She said, look, for half the year you could be male, and for half the year you could be female, and for half the year you can menstruate, and for the half the year you can be a man. And so if you grew up in the West, particularly as a gender realist, you would say, well, that's just not true. That's just a confusion. That's just a performance of gender, but you really are a man or a woman. Those constructions just don't hold much weight or water in a sort of indifferent cultural rubric or perspective that accommodates gender ambiguity, because they don't rely on the dualisms of either or. So once again, what we're trying to draw on here is not whether something is true or not, but what it is to say that something is a social construction. If it's a social construction, it is unique to the guiding characteristics and assumptions of a particular time and place, a particular society, which means it is not true for all people in all places in all time. It's not a transcendent universal truth. And so that's why it can be really tricky to make social constructivist claims and sort of cash them out as scientific fact, where scientific fact carries the weight of sort of universal transcendent assumptions. That's where, on the feminist philosophical view, things can get really problematic. Okay, let's turn now to the last version, the subjectivist theory of gender identity. Now, the subjectivist theory of gender identity, as Hannah argues, is going to reject the realist and the constructivist view of gender, because both are based on factors outside the individual whose identity is in question. So this is the one that the subjectivist theory of gender identity is the one that existentialists would like the most. They would be like, yep, we're taking this one, right? And so this theory holds that while social views of what makes a man or a woman may indeed inform your understanding of gender, the underlying motivation for the individual's choice to perform those roles versus others is based on the private psychological states or emotions, how you feel, right, that the individual experiences and uses to formulate their beliefs. So how you feel about your gender, right, is going to inform the subjective. So if you feel like you're a man trapped inside a woman's body, if you feel like a woman trapped inside if you feel like an intersex individual that's trapped within one particular one-dimensional gender, that's going to inform your gender identity. So just like political views are based on an individual's beliefs about social views, right, of politics, they're already there. So your political beliefs can be a sort of, amalgamation or rejection or adaptation of the different political views that already exist. For the subjectivists, and this just generally speaking, they're going to hold that the nature of existence of certain objects, properties, or identities depends solely on the individual's beliefs or belief states. In other words, Hanrahan is going to argue, to be a subjectivist about gender is to hold that whether a person is a man or a woman is similarly determined by his or her beliefs. If you believe you're a man, right, then you're going to be a man. The Cher's son is the singer Cher is an example of somebody that gave a particular account that they did not feel as if they belonged in the body that they were born in, and thereby had sexual reassignment surgery on the basis of a realist view. So on that view, if I were to change something that's real about me, something that the realist perspective can say about myself, then it will harmonize or accord much more easily with my subjective account of my gender identity. Okay? Examples. So this is one that's actually pretty recent in the news. The WikiLeaks sort of example, the Bradley Manning story. Now, one of the many ways unfortunate topics of discussion when discussing the sort of national security information is that Bradley Manning's gender came to be seen as ethically suspect. That Bradley Manning actually wants to have self-identifies as a woman and wants to be called Chelsea Manning. If we actually take a look and read through this particular selection of the Wall Street Journal, if you look at the bottom, this is what makes it a subjectivist theory of gender. She's quoted as saying, I am female, Manning said in the statement. Given the way that I feel and have felt since childhood, I want to begin hormone therapy as soon as possible. Okay, so there's at least two theories of the construction of gendered identity there. What are they? The subjectivist, and what else? The realist. Where is it? I want to begin hormone therapy. Why would hormone therapy map onto the realist? Because the hormones are sort of the biological, physiological, concrete sort of entities that inform our physiological makeup. And so on that account, to change something about your biological body is to change something about your gender identity. Now, one of the things that's most important under the feminist philosophical perspective of outlining critically, rigorously, and clearly these three different versions of identity is that it has very real-world consequences. If we are able to understand that these are particular perspectives, that the realist account is one particular, very important in terms of our Western history nonetheless, but one particular looking glass through which we can interpret gender, then the incredible weight that an individual's psychic life may have to bear if he or she does not identify on the basis of the sex to which they are assigned or the sex to which they have grown into in terms of their culture, they may be able to better accommodate some of the feelings of inadequacy. They're very painful, very real. I mean, think of what it must be like to go through gender reassignment surgery. Think that is not a painless endeavor. Think of the psychic weight. Think of the which is not to say that the argument here is not that one ought not to do that, that is not to be pursued, but that many times the underlying assumptions for why one is to pursue something remain unexamined or uncritically assumed. And so this may help sort of release the pressure, unburden the weight of social pressure so that one can better accommodate the sort of sometimes contradictory experiences of one's gender, or when one's gender does not feel like it is sort of unproblematically one's own. So it has very real life consequences here. Okay, so let's see how this shows up in Boys Don't Cry. Now, Boys Don't Cry is based on a true story of Brandon Teena, sometimes say Teena Brandon. And it's a sort of, it was very, very well known, less and less every year. It's less known, but particularly early, in the early 2000s, you certainly knew of the story quite well. One of the most tragic cases of prejudiced violence against sexual minorities. And so the movie is completely based on this particular story. And it's going to outline three distinct versions of gender identity. And they're very, very fairly easy to see. There's the version of realism, right? And if we take the realist perspective, then we're going to say that Brandon was never a man. We're going to say that he was always a woman. And I leave some of these scenes out, particularly because of the context, particularly the rape scene, which we can describe, but we don't need to re-represent it, at least graphically here. That if you remember and think back on that particular scene in the movie, that the characters, the perpetrators of the crime, are basing the justifications for their violence on redefining and wanting to say, on the realist view of sexual identity or gendered identity, that Brandon is actually never a man. It's a woman. Why? Because those are the parts he has. He was born with, and in the movie they say lady parts, right? So because that's what you were born with, on the basis of that, your gender identity is going to be determined in advance and fixed like an essence. It is biologically reductive, and everything else is going to be an act, a con. You're going to con people, even including yourself, on the realist view, if you betray the fundamental biological fact that you're a woman on this realist view. So this is how, by reducing things to biological reductivist views of gender identity, certain forms of violence can be sanctified or done. Now, the second view in the movie is the gender constructivism. Okay, now gender constructivism shows up in the idea that Brandon was a man during the time in Falls City, right, where he sort of properly all the different ways of acting, with the swagger, with the type of bravado, with the type of asking a girl out, dating a girl, the Chloe Sevigny character, the Lana character. In all the different ways into which Brandon enacted maleness, the typical sort of, youthful truant of running amok around town with friends, drinking beer, smoking cigarettes. Then for the time in which he successfully enacted those roles, he was a man, right? That's the constructivist view. Now, the third view is the subjectivist view, or subjectivism. And that one shows up in the idea that Brandon was a man from the moment that Teena felt like a man, which was pretty much always, right? There was always a sense in which the early Teena always felt there was something very, very different about him, and that he was just simply arbitrarily born a woman, but that indeed it didn't correspond to gendered identity. So those are the three individual perspectives in the film. Now, this is what we really have to understand, okay? The argument that Harnahan makes, because it's a little bit winding or a little bit complicated. So you can see how the three themes show up clearly in the film. But here's what you can't forget about Hanrahan's article. So, okay. So first she starts to make a really important view about the view of gender that's endorsed in the film. She says, look, we see all three theories of gender are in Boys Don't Cry. The realist perspective, but clearly from the way in which the story is narrated, we get the sense that the filmmaker, or the perspective, the visual perspective that's presented to the audience, does not agree with that. Which is to say, if thinking back particularly to the the scene of Brandon's violation, it does not sanction that. It clearly does not sanction that, or it's saying this is an act of violence. It is making a case that this is this perspective, this realist perspective, may be present, but it doesn't agree with it, right? And by the way, this is how we can say, we can make the case that Boys Don't Cry actually does philosophy, because it's presenting an argument, right? It's presenting, saying, this is a possibility, but it's not endorsed, right? So it doesn't agree with the realist perspective. And it actually operates from a constructivist perspective, okay? So you actually see throughout the whole movie the way in which Tina, here Brandon, is actually able to really successfully interpret social codes and characteristics of maleness to such a degree, between the haircut, between sexual practices, ways of taking up hobbies, that Brandon's actually able to operate from the constructivist perspective as a man. But in the end, it tries to critique the constructivist perspective. So even though Brandon may have successfully performed maleness or masculinity as his gender in his time in Fall City, it actually was not the view that the film seeks to endorse. Why is this the case? Okay, we need to walk through this argument. So according to Hanrahan, gender constructivism, right, holds that social norms define conceptions of gender, right? Whether it's femininity. So what's a social norm, conception of gender? Think of contemporary conceptions of gender. We have the sort of Sports Illustrated Swimsuit edition, Victoria's Secret catalog. Social norms define gender as a particular type of conception. Now, it can be completely varied, right? We go to Sub-Saharan Africa, we have different conceptions of gender. And so there's really no litmus test. There's no overarching filter through which we can say, that one's okay, that one's not okay, that one's kind of harmful, that one's not as harmful. Whatever criteria society associates with manhood is going to define gender. And so what can be problematic about that? Well, if manhood is associated with machismo and bravado and some forms of violence, then if you can successfully perform sort of bravado and masculinity, hypermasculinity, and sort of wanton disrespect for women. These are, of course, in many ways parodies and essentialisms in themselves, but for the sake of explaining this, then gender constructivism holds. And that seems to be problematic, the film seems to be saying at the end. Because today's society seems to associate the act of penetration as a criteria for manhood, right? That if you are penetrating, that there's something penetrated, that there's something about the laws of manhood versus a particular action. And this, according to Hanrahan, can license acts of rape, acts of violence. If it is the case that if constructivism is the only thing that matters, then we have ourselves a serious philosophical problem at the moral level. This is a question of moral philosophy. Is gender constructivism a moral account of gender identity? On this account, as a feminist philosopher, Hanrahan is saying, no, because gender constructivism on this account can license acts of rape. And so it's not a moral perspective. It's not, in terms of moral philosophy, gender constructivism is morally problematic. In other words, gender constructivism can't be fully endorsed from the feminist philosophical perspective because it doesn't take into account things like power structures in society, or like how those power structures in society can really influence what is the quote-unquote criteria for social practices. So at the end, after the terrible scene of Brandon's violation, think about the way in which the sheriff takes the testimony, right? Does the sheriff take Brandon's testimony seriously? Where does Brandon end up, in which jail, right? What jail do they assign him to? The women's jail, the males? without acts of rape against men. It becomes very problematic if we just take gender constructivism as the dominant theory or the true theory of what makes gender identity whole. And so one of the ways in which Hanahan really shows this beautifully is she says, look, think about what happens to Brendan's identity after the rape, right? Then it becomes really indeterminate. Right up until that moment, especially right before the jail scene, like the jumpsuit scene, Brendan just consistently had this, either by performing it or by the words that he used, even when he was Tina, consistently said and performed as if that it was based on a feeling, right? He had felt complete. It was his feelings. It was a subjectivist account as a man. He had felt complete. But because this of the gender constructivism in this culture is based on things like penetration, this is called into question, right? One's identity is then indeterminate. So what's really happening here is that Hanahan is trying to validate the subjectivist perspective through the film. In other words, she's saying that the film is at the end of the day trying, it's kind of like a social piece, a social or a political or philosophical work that just happens to be in film. But it's trying to argue for, to make a case for, to give reasons for, to give an allegory, to present an illusion, to validate the subjectivist perspective while making a social and political statement, right? What is that social political statement? We may want the subjectivist perspective because the subjectivist perspective does not seem to fall prey to the kinds of problems, namely the moral dilemmas that come from accepting gender constructivism as the sole basis of gender identity. So while she's trying to validate the subjectivist perspective through the film, it's also making a kind of political statement. What is that? That although we may want the subjectivist perspective because it escapes the moral dilemma of constructivism, it's not possible yet in society to successfully adopt a subjectivist perspective of gender. There is work still to be done. It is a political kind of claim that says there's a task that is still ahead, and that task must be taken as the basis of a social, political kinds of claims. So here we start to see how one branch of value theory, feminist philosophy, may start to kind of harmonize and bleed into another example of value theory, political or social and political philosophy, where out of some of the perspectives and need to pursue feminist values, one must also pursue social and political perspectives that harmonize or work in tandem with those feminist perspectives, and thereby works through value theory. So that's feminist philosophy for you, an example of feminist philosophy as value theory. Okay, so what's next? So this is a little bit of a short lecture for you because I really want you to kind of focus, take notes, read, review as much as you can, study your notes. That's going to be the key to getting 100 on this exam. It's going to cover the same things, just this lecture, the reading, and the movie. Remember, we're reading the movie as a text in this course, so you can have questions all about the movie as well as this lecture. If you've listened to this lecture, taken notes on this lecture, gone back and studied the notes, then you're going to do fantastic. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and see you for Unit 6, the last one. Take care.